Hey everybody, welcome back to Mass Office Hours. If you caught the episode last week, then you already know tonight's episode will not be a live recording. The reason being I'm out of town to present at a conference, but we didn't want to leave you folks empty-handed, so tonight we are playing a pre-recorded video, and this is actually a video that Mike Zordos made for an earlier issue of the Mass Research Review. So if you're not a subscriber, this is a little sneak peek at what some of our video content looks like within the Mass Research Review. So it's a very practical video. We think you are going to love it. Hope you have a great week, and we will see you next Wednesday night for another live episode of Mass Office Hours.
Hi everyone, welcome to my video in Volume 7, Issue 9 of Mass for September 2023. As you can see on the title of this video, we're going to be talking about exercise order, specifically exercise order part 1 for strength adaptations, and the subtext, what comes first, multi or single joint movements. There's been a lot of talk over the years of exercise order, and essentially the old adage is that for both strength and hypertrophy, the multi-joint or the larger exercises should come first, and then the secondary or single joint exercises should come later. Now there's a lot of theories behind this. One related to muscle activation. Will muscle activation be lower? This is specifically for hypertrophy on movements that are performed secondarily, meaning when fatigue sets in. For hypertrophy, do you want to get the acute hormone release with the exercises performed first and utilize that for the exercises performed later? While today we're going to be focusing on strength, those are some of the theories around hypertrophy that we'll get to in part 2. For strength, it's a little more straightforward, which is, are you stronger on the exercises you perform first because you don't have as much fatigue? And in that case, should you prioritize those exercises? And it seems pretty intuitive to say yes, and not to spoil everything, but the data is going to mostly support that. But I do want to talk today about some nuances around that, because it doesn't always make sense in every situation, and rarely do we use the term always. It doesn't always make sense to say, hey, I'm stronger when I do an exercise first, so therefore I have to always do this exercise first. Well, you may have multiple goals, and there's only so many days a week to train, and you have to prioritize this exercise over this exercise. Maybe you have a weakness, even though it's not a competition lift in powerlifting or weightlifting, but you have a weakness you need to address, and you need to move that exercise out front. So we're going to get into the objectives here in just a moment, but in short, we're going to talk about the data surrounding exercise order for strength today. Do you or should you place exercises first that are most important for strength progress? And then in what situations might we modify this to take into account the practical application? So our objectives, as we said, the common thoughts on considering exercise order, and we just went into a little bit of that on the title slide. The data on the order of multi versus single joint exercises for strength specifically. Provide examples on how to prioritize certain exercises to be first in the training order. So what I'm getting at here is if we consider the powerlifter, the squat, bench press, and deadlift, well, that's 3 different exercises we need to prioritize. We need to kind of rectify being able to prioritize each one while also being able to train each one frequently enough, and then understanding in a powerlifting meet, if this is your goal, that the bench press and deadlift come after the squat. So yes, you should prioritize them at times to maximize bench press strength, but additionally, what you can bench press as a powerlifter when you go into the gym for just 1 rep when doing nothing before it isn't as important as what you can bench press for 1 rep after you do a max squat, because that's what you need to do on competition day. So it's an example of saying, hey, yes, I need to put this movement out front perhaps to maximize strength, but additionally, in certain situations, I'll need to utilize or train this movement after another movement because that's how it is when I go to my specific competition. Number 4 on the objectives, consider if specific weaknesses should influence the exercise order, right? For the bench press, your shoulders, you have to improve your military press, or you have to improve your shoulder strength, or let's say it's your tricep strength. In that case, is there a situation where you might prioritize one of those exercises, maybe not all the time, but maybe for a short training block to try and boost strength on that specific muscle group to then help the overall movement? And so then we'll talk about some other practical considerations. All right, so the common considerations for exercise order, it's been just pretty well accepted for a long time. And as I alluded to already, we're not saying that's wrong. It is indeed correct for the most part based upon the literature that for strength adaptation, if you want to maximize strength on something, you should do that exercise first. But it is always interesting to go back and hear the reasons why people are stating that or what governing bodies are saying around that, and then saying, hey, that may be the case, and we've already mentioned some of these limitations and some of these applications. That may be the case, but in certain situations, you may need to modify this a little bit. But the typical traditional thought is that the multi-joint or compound movement should be done first. In fact, the American College of Sports Medicine position stand on resistance training suggests that multi-joint exercises should come first. Again, pretty sound advice for the most part. For strength, it's been said that perhaps muscle activation is diminished when multi-joint exercises are performed second, right? So you have the fatigue from the single joint exercise, and this could be viewed as a negative. Is that indeed the case? For strength, load lifted can be impaired due to fatigue when multi-joint exercises are performed first. And so in that case, when we just think about that logically on that last bullet point, if you're performing, the multi-joint exercise second, and then you do that single joint exercise first, let's say you do some triceps extensions and you go to the bench press and you try to do a max bench press, certainly you're going to be fatigued. So that follows a pretty logical pattern of what we would expect. But is there that situation, as we talked about, where you might want to prioritize those tricep extensions or that shoulder press? But these are all the common thoughts, and these are all pretty logical. Follow a generally well-recommended, kind of vein of what we should do with exercise order. I'm not so sold on the muscle activation one, but the rest of them, I think, are pretty well understood. There's a couple previous mass articles on this, so at this point in the video, if you haven't read either of these articles, which I wrote both of these, I would suggest going and checking them out. We're going to reference the second one. You want to get better at something, do it first here, that review to meta-analysis, and I am going to talk about that meta-analysis in this video. So it would be a great idea to go check that out first, then come back and finish the rest of this video. So think of the variables that drive each outcome. So we did state a little bit of this, but just for strength, because that's the focus of today. Think of what the priorities are for strength. Yes, volume to an extent, but load lifted and the skill on that movement. So if we're thinking of exercises that we care about strength on, typically they're going to be the more skilled movements. Yes, it's great when strength goes up on a biceps curl, but that's not typically what we're maxing out on in the gym. We're thinking of squat, bench press, deadlift, snatch, clean and jerk, maybe overhead press, these sorts of things. So if we're performing those first or early in the training session, right, we're not as fatigued. If we're not as fatigued, we're going to be able to lift more weight. And if we're not as fatigued, our motor patterns are probably going to be a bit more on point. We're going to be a bit more mentally engaged and also being able to maximize that skill. If you're moving that squat or that bench press after you do another exercise or two that trains those muscle groups, you're going to be fatigued. Your skill might be a bit affected on them. You're not quite as focused. You're certainly not going to feel as strong due to the fatigue. And those are the components, the load that you're lifting, skill on that movement, that are related to strength adaptations on those movements. Additionally, volume does play a role in strength, and volume would likely be affected as well. Now, in muscle growth, which we're going to talk about in part 2, we'll focus more on volume and the muscle activation component. If you perform an exercise later in the order, is the muscle activation diminished from the earlier exercise, and does that indeed negatively affect long-term hypertrophy outcomes? Again, practical considerations, and then some examples on specific goals related to powerlifting here. But here's our focus for strength. Are the load lifted, the volume, and the skill affected if you move an exercise that you're mostly concerned on strength on to later in the order in training session? So exercise order for strength, I want to look at 3 studies here. A meta-analysis here from Nunez et al. In 2001, and that's from the previous mass article that I mentioned that I'd reviewed. And then 2 studies from Simo and Diaz, both original research studies. I chose these 2 specifically because one is an acute study and one is a longitudinal study. So the acute study is going to show us in a crossover design when different exercise orders are compared, what happens to the volume and the load lifted. And then Diaz et al. Will show us how that plays out over time. As I've mentioned many times in mass before, and really with so much of the research that we discuss, just because something occurs acutely doesn't mean it continues to manifest over the long term. So when we look at literature, it's always nice to look at an acute study and say, hey, is volume harmed or impaired in this case when exercises are placed later in the order? If yes, then what happens when you repeat that longitudinally? Does that volume or load lifted or skill continue to be impaired, and does it lead to attenuated strength adaptation? So that's why we chose both the Simo and the Diaz study, and then we'll look at what the Nunez study says about everything. So in general, if you follow the arrow down before we get into these individual research outputs, we can see overall, if you care about strength on an exercise, you should probably prioritize it. So these studies do show that repetition performance in load lifted can be negatively affected on that specific exercise when you're already fatigued from performing another exercise or training that muscle group. So if we start here with the Simo study, this is the acute study, that crossover design I mentioned. So there's two conditions here, and 23 recreationally trained women took part in the study. There's a multi-joint first condition and a single joint first condition. So individuals came in one time, and they performed, if we follow here, 3 sets to failure at 80% of 1RM on each of these exercises, and the researchers tracked the number of reps performed and the volume performed. The multi-joint first order had, the condition had this order. The single joint first order had this order. So you can see multi-joint first for the upper body, bench press, followed by shoulder press, followed by triceps extension. Then they took on the lower body. Leg press, followed by leg extension, followed by leg curl. So it follows a pretty logical pattern for both upper and lower body. It was the reverse order and the single joint order. You can see out of the 3 lower body exercises, the leg press was performed last, preceded by the leg curl and extension, the single joint movements. And then here, bench press performed last, preceded by the single joint tricep extension. And the shoulder press, which is typically not as focused on from, let's say, a 1RM perspective as the bench press. So good job by the authors when allocating these orders here. Now, the findings from this study, right? If we can see, if we look at this table, what this plots, or what this states in the table, I should say, is that across all 3 sets, this is the average number of reps performed by the women in each condition across all 3 sets. The ones in red and with the asterisks are significantly more reps in the multi-joint or single joint condition. So the bench press, for example, an average of 8.4 reps versus an average of 6.0 reps, about 2.4 more reps when the bench press was performed first. If we can go back here, that makes sense. Bench press, if we just take the 3 upper body exercises performed first in the order of the exercises that should fatigue bench press, it's performed last in the order here. So it's pretty logical, it follows that pattern. The shoulder press was better off in the multi-joint condition here. The tricep extension better in the single joint. If we go back, we can see over here of the 3 upper body exercises, the tricep extension performed before the shoulder and bench press. So if we just pause here for a moment, this is kind of getting at what I alluded to earlier, which is that in some cases, for certain weaknesses, you may want to prioritize on a day of the week some of these other musculature if someone has a weakness that they need to bring up, and their triceps they need to bring up. Of course, other ways to do that, but the strength did improve more on a triceps extension when it was prioritized. So I doubt a powerlifter would want to prioritize that all the time, or just generally somebody interested in bench press strength. But it is a rationale to say, hey, maybe there is a time to do this if that's really where I'm lacking. This follows a similar pattern. We can see the leg press was better when it was prioritized, and then the single joint movements here for lower body were better when they were prioritized. So this followed that pattern for every single exercise in this study. Pretty convincing evidence, at least acutely, that when you place exercises, no matter the exercise, earlier in the training order during the training session, that strength is going to be a bit better. Volume is going to be a bit better on those exercises. So a rationale for strength to do an exercise first that you want to get better at. But if we go to the Diaz study, does that play out over time? So this is a longitudinal training study, as we can see here. There's 3 groups, a multi-joint, a single joint, and then a control group. And so if we just consider the multi-joint group and single joint group, they trained 3 times a week, 3 sets for an 8 to 12 RM, and then load was increased when reps, the subjects were able to exceed this range for these reps. Now, there were untrained men in this study, so when you're going to see on the next slide, you're going to see some pretty robust increases in strength. But remember, these individuals were untrained and they trained pretty frequently for 8 weeks. So multi-joint first order, a lot of the same exercises, a few different, but a lot of the same exercises that we saw in the SIMO study. So bench press, lat pull down, machine shoulder press, bar curls, and tricep extensions, right? These multi-joint movements followed by single joint movements. We see the opposite order in the single joint group, single joint movements followed by multi-joint movements, you can see with bench press last. So if we take every single exercise and we look at the percentage increase in strength over the course of those 8 weeks, we can see it follows a very reliable pattern in Diaz that follows the pattern of SIMO et al. The percentage changes, again, are quite robust, but if we take triceps extension, for example, 77.8% increase in strength, that sounds pretty jarring, but if somebody only had a 10 kilogram, they're complete beginner, a 10 kilogram max on this, and now they're talking about going up to 17.5 kilograms, that's roughly the change that you're seeing in this. So on an absolute scale, it's not that much, and it's not too unexpected for individuals who were completely untrained going into the study, training 3 times per week. But the bench press, lat pull down, and shoulder press, all the exercises that were prioritized here, a multi-joint first improved, and then single joint first improved when they were prioritized. So I think kind of a misnomer of a way to state exercise order for strength is multi-joint exercises should be performed first. A better way to state that is probably the exercises that you care about strength on should be performed first. So if you care about strength on other movements, you should perform those first. Perhaps if you have a weakness somewhere and you really need to bring that up to aid your main lift, let's say you have a long time before your next powerlifting meet and you've got to work on your shoulders, you've got to work on your triceps, whatever it might be. In that case, you might want to perform those exercises first. I don't think that's something that happens super frequently or all the time, but it is a situation when that I think can come up when you frame this not as multi-joint exercises should be performed first, but if you want to get better at something, you should do that thing first, whatever that exercise might be. So if we quickly go through the results of the Nunez et al. Meta-analysis, just to show that we're not just taking a couple studies here that show something wildly different, the DS study does stand out a little bit, but we're seeing most of these dots on this force plot to the right of this line, which in the Nunez meta, these are the strength results. And so most of these effects, right, were favoring when strength to increase specifically on the exercises that were performed first. And if we go to the table from this Nunez, we can see for all of these things, right, whether it's multi-joint exercises, when they were performed first versus performed second, the effect size was positive and it was significant in favor of strength on multi-joint exercises being better when it was performed first. Same thing for single joint, same thing for a specific exercise like a squat or a bench press, same thing for free weight exercises in general and machine-based exercises in general. So again, the way to state this isn't multi-joint exercises should be performed first. They should be if that's your goal, right? Bench press should be performed first if that's your goal, squat, deadlift, whatever it might be. But in general, the exercise you want to get better at should be performed first or at least earlier in the order. And we've mentioned situations where there might be exceptions, but we'll get into those soon. So the strength summary, if you're concerned about strength on a lift or specifically the squat, bench press, and deadlift, because we're going to give some powerlifting examples in a moment, you should do those first. Additionally, data show that any exercise should be performed first. And then under the state of fatigue, why? Well, mechanistically, you're fatigued, you're tired, you're not going to be able to lift as much volume or as much absolute load potentially. Potentially your skill is impaired on a specific exercise. So it's not just, hey, you could say less volume. That may lead to less muscle growth, which we'll talk about in part 2. I'm not saying it does or it doesn't. We'll look at those findings. But independent of that, what's your skill level now on a squat if you're fatigued from doing a bunch of leg extensions and leg curls? What's your skill level on a bench press if you're fatigued from doing a bunch of shoulder presses and triceps? And then conversely, if you want to prioritize shoulder presses and triceps, you might want to move those up front. So questions and practical considerations for strength, as we've been talking about. So in the subtext here, yes, the exercise you're concerned about you should do first, but relevant for prioritizing each on certain occasions. What does that mean? That refers to the squat, bench press, and deadlift. So if you think practically a powerlifter that needs to prioritize these movements, maybe they want to train each of them 2 or 3 times a week. Well, if you want to train each of these movements 2 or 3 times a week, there are only so many days a week. So you can't perform each one of them first every single time that you train them. If you train each 3 times per week and there's 7 days in a week, most probably aren't training 7 days a week, somewhere between, 4 or 5 days a week, something like that. You're going to have to get a little bit inventive, and you're going to have to prioritize 1 or 2 lifts on one day and then another lift on another day. And so there may be situations where some of those lifts are done second. And that's probably a good idea, not only from the practical aspect of prioritizing each lift on different days, but as I mentioned earlier, from the aspect of in a powerlifting competition, you're going to bench press and deadlift after you squat. So at some points, you need to practice like you play, and we're going to talk about that. So relevant for addressing a weakness, meaning the data showing that any exercise someone is concerned with should be moved out front. We'll talk about when that's the case or when that should happen. So navigating the order of squat, bench press, and deadlift. So it might be ideal to have an exercise first, but if you're a powerlifter, you have to consider 3 things when determining your exercise order. The main lifts might need to be staggered to ensure that performance isn't impaired on another lift. What do we mean by that? Well, if somebody's only training 3-4 days a week, that's what they have time to get in, which is totally appropriate. Then this individual may have some hypertrophy sessions, some strength sessions, some really heavy sessions, some power sessions, whatever it might be on the squat, bench press, and deadlift. And they want to train each of those movements, let's say 2 to 3 times per week. Well, if you can only train 3 days per week in that case, and you perform some heavy squats, you're going to want to make sure, or some, let's say, hypertrophy squats, right? A bunch of volume of 8-10 reps. You're going to want to make sure that your heavy bench press doesn't come right after it. It could, but it's probably going to be impaired a little bit. And while you do want to practice like you play and perform bench press after you squat, remember, in a powerlifting competition, you're doing 3 heavy singles on squat, then benching. That's a different type of fatigue than doing 5 sets of 10 on squats and then benching really, really heavy. So I'd probably avoid the situation where in the exercise order, you're doing a lot of hypertrophy type of squats or high volume type of squats, and then some heavy bench press after it. So you might want to stagger these days. So a lighter bench press day falls after a hypertrophy type squatting day or something of that nature. Or you prioritize bench press and it becomes first when you have some really, really heavy bench press. And then that may not fatigue you as much for some more hypertrophy type of squats. Similar kind of thing with a deadlift. So you might want to stagger these. I'll show you an example of that in just a moment. So sometimes, again, you'll actually want to perform the bench press or deadlift after the squat to mimic competition conditions. So consider staggering, number 1. Consider performing some exercises second. And then 3, consider moving exercises up in the order to address weak points. So this stuff we've alluded to already, but I'm going to talk about all 3 of these and show a couple specific examples. So understand how to stagger the order for the power lifts. Over the years, I've talked about this in mass a few times, but I think a basic example is worth reiterating before we go to a spreadsheet program. So utilize the various programming strategies so that the second exercise in the order is relatively ineffective. So let's say somebody is training a hypertrophy type day or a high volume type day, a power or explosive type day, and a strength type day within the course of a week. You, of course, don't have to train this way, but this just allows us, for simplicity, to demonstrate this staggering type of strategy. And so let's just use the squat and bench press for a moment for teaching purposes, again, before we get into a spreadsheet example. Somebody's training Monday, Wednesday, Friday. You have a hypertrophy or high volume type of day, a power or explosive type of day, and then a strength type of day. Well, if you set things up, right, this is a very simple way to set things up. But if you have these high volume squats followed by high volume bench presses on this day, and then some heavier squats, still with a decent amount of volume, followed by some heavier bench presses, still with a decent amount of volume, you're probably going to be fatigued by the time you get to the bench press. And that's okay in some cases. But again, when you bench press after a squat in a competition, you are not doing a bunch of sets of 8s on squats. You're doing a couple singles. And so in this case, what we're not seeing in this first example is we're not prioritizing the bench press at all by putting it first in the exercise order, which we look at the data we just talked about from the Nunez meta-analysis. Bench press strength may not be optimized over time if we do that. Additionally, you're probably benching under more fatigue than you generally would in a meet after a couple heavy singles on squat. So what I might do is stagger these. Just because you do the high volume squats one day doesn't mean that you have to do the heavy bench presses afterwards. For example, This asterisk on Monday suggests that bench is done first, right? We've noted that in the notes here. So some heavier bench press and then some higher volume squats afterwards. But if you've noticed on the higher volume squats, we've dropped a rep from 8 to 7, and then we've added a set from 4 to 5 to compensate for that dropped rep. So you're still getting a decent amount of volume on squats here, slightly more, and you're doing so after the heavy bench. The heavier bench probably wouldn't fatigue somebody as much as the high volume squat, but in the event that it has a little bit of fatigue, in this case, we're making the squats a bit more feasible by dropping a rep and keeping the same percentage. Of course, you can program with repetitions in reserve or RP or velocity if you like. So that's a way to stagger these, bring the bench press out front on this day, match these up so the heavier work that you care about most for strength, because that's our goal here in this specific case, is done first, and then that volume squat is done afterwards. Over here, we have an explosive or power type squatting, and then we have some hypertrophy or higher volume type bench afterwards. That shouldn't be an issue to get this bench press done. This is pretty light squatting. And then over here, we have our heavier squats followed by explosive type bench. So we've staggered everything to bench first sometimes and prioritize that strength, and then squat first sometimes and prioritize that strength when we have to do them on the same day. So making sure we're manipulating that exercise order appropriately, consistent with the data we just looked at, but we're not compromising the other lift on that day due to unnecessary fatigue. So a closer examination, right? Let's say we now always separate the squat and bench, because the example I just gave was showing how to stagger them. But if you always separate them and somebody's just doing some volume here at some pretty moderate intensities, pretty moderate loads, let's say a typical thing, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, pretty high volume program, just squatting 3 sets of 10, 65% of 1RM, same thing for bench on Tuesdays, and then the reps going down to 8, percentage of 1RM going up on squat and bench press Wednesday, Thursday, same thing on Friday. Simple to separate those, simple to put in assistant movement, very straightforward. Again, just a conceptual example. Not saying you have to do all these assistance exercises, not saying you have to program with percentages. It's just to show everything in a very straightforward manner. This is always separating them. But it's probably not advantageous to always separate these exercises, especially as somebody gets closer to a competition, right? So in this case, we're going to show some, quote, powerlifting specific staggering and weak point prioritizing. So if we look, we're not restricted to just 3 days per week in the first very simplistic example, but now let's say this person is training 5 days per week. So we have a squat day here, a bench press day here, some lighter deadlifting, singles at 80% after a squat. That's a non-issue. Exercise order seems to be prioritized on both of these days. It's really not a problem. So now, if we go to Wednesday, we can see squat and bench press, and I'll talk about the or board press in a moment. Well, we can see here some lighter squat and bench press, still some decent work, triples at 80%, but not a problem to do triples at 80% on bench press. You know, let's say these are maybe as much as a 5 RAR for some, maybe a 2 to 3 RAR for others, depending on how good that individual is at reps perform. And then some lighter deadlifting, you know, afterwards, few reps in reserve, shouldn't be too much of an issue. Now, on Friday, we can see here some heavier squat and bench press, a double at an 8 RPE for 2 sets and a single at an 8 to 9 RPE on squat and then on bench press. Why is that there? Well, that is there. We're going to see a few reasons in this program. One, that's much more specific to a competition. So it's pretty heavy, but it's pretty low volume. And now you're getting used to seeing what you can bench after you squat. Because that heavier day is here, we have a lighter day that kind of precedes it, maybe to prepare the individuals. But what this also allows us to do by combining these on the same day, if we can go to the weekend training. One day on the weekend, this lifter is going to train, and they're going to prioritize military press. So this is getting to the kind of subtitle on this slide, powerlifting specific staggering, right? Making sure we're getting bench press after the squat on this more competition-like day. And then weak point prioritizing. So we have military press here to prioritize that. Just let's say this individual has weaker shoulders that they kind of need to bring up. We can prioritize that in this case. There would be other movements, other exercises for other people, of course. But this allows us to accomplish all of the things that we've talked about. It says bench press or board press here. Let's say this person really needs to work on their lockouts in this case. And that's a trouble spot. That's a weak point, you know, as they bring the barbell up on the movement. Well, they could potentially cut this bench press out and utilize board press here. They shouldn't be too fatigued because they have the lighter squatting. Or if they really needed to go heavier on board press, they could flip this order, put that first, go a little bit heavier, and then put squat second in the order, which shouldn't be a problem because of how they're utilizing it. So when we want to prioritize exercises for strength, we want to prioritize them at the right time and how is appropriate for our goals. If you're always prioritizing one movement, then it's going to be difficult to prioritize others. If you're a lifter that's solely interested in strength on one movement, then that may be the case for you, that you do prioritize that, barring when you need to prioritize something else from a weak point. But for a power lifter, it's not as cut and dry saying, do that exercise first. Yes, you're going to need to do each first sometimes when you can, but you only have so many days in a week to train. You have 3 lifts that you have to prioritize strength on. You have to then also account for the practice like you play phenomenon of benching and deadlifting after you squat, while also maybe giving some days where you're benching and deadlifting alone to prioritize them and maximize strength, but then being more competition specific at points too when they're second or third in the order, and then also addressing weak points. So hopefully these examples help to kind of show that. Again, they're just conceptual. They're not the only ways to go about this, right? It's really, as with so many things, like a never-ending conversation of how and when you can prioritize and the different ways to do this. But for this what I would call like a quote program troubleshooting type of thing, which is really what this is, I would take a look at this example and see the different ways that you can construct this to fit your goals if you're focused on, if you need to bring up a weak point, or you're focused on strength on a few different specific exercises, and just keep working through it. Eventually it will come, but this is kind of a conceptual template of how to do that. So additional thoughts from a coach's perspective, as we just talked about, pay attention to somebody's specific goals. It is nice to know the data. Yes, an exercise should come first for strength adaptation. However, what is needed for appropriate preparation for this person? Not only to put it first sometimes, but to when does it come in a competition, to put it after something else in training, to see what they can do in that state of fatigue, because they may have to do that on the platform, or they may have to do it under this specific situation. Pay attention to weaknesses. And then generally, sometimes a change in order might be good from a psychological perspective. So even if somebody is interested in maximizing strength on a squat or a deadlift, maybe they don't have any competitions or have to test the strength for a very long while, and they're 6 months out from that. So maybe you do move this back in the order and just accumulate some volume on it while you're prioritizing something else or a variant of that movement, just because they're a bit fatigued, they're a bit burned out from doing this for a long time. And I think that's very valid in some cases. So it's nice to know the data, and we should always base everything on the data, put that at the forefront. But there are some specific situations I think we've outlined here where you have to conceptually understand that data, apply it, and maybe work around it just a little bit. So applications and takeaways for strength. Again, it's generally a good idea to perform an exercise earlier in the order during a training session. Prioritize it. You should be a bit stronger on it. You'll probably be able to do a bit more volume. Your skill should be a little bit better. All of those things because you're not as fatigued from doing, let's say, triceps extensions before a bench press. The principle of exercise order holds not only with the main lifts, but also assistance movements. So again, it's probably a better way to state for strength and exercise order that you should put any exercise first or at the top of the order that you care about improving strength on, and not just saying, hey, multi-joint exercises should be performed first, because that's assuming that those are the only exercises that everybody cares about strength on. If you do have a specific goal, such as powerlifting, and that's relevant, then the coach and lifter will need to prioritize these movements, right? We talked about staggering those when needed, to make sure, let's say, you can only train 3 days a week, and you have to perform heavy squats and bench presses. You probably don't want those to fall on the same day. You probably don't want to be doing heavy bench presses after you do 5-6 sets of high volume squatting. So on that day, you'd probably move the bench presses up front, making sure you are prioritizing what you need to, but you're also managing fatigue, and you're practicing like you play and performing the bench press and deadlift after the squat at times, because that's how you do it in the competition. And then some assistance movements can be prioritized in order if that is a specific weak point. So I thought this was relevant here today. It's another lesson in a way of understanding research conceptually. And then to me, the best part of this video is this back half here, because we were able to talk about those concepts and put them into practice. So again, I'd go back to those spreadsheets if this is something you've been thinking about. Look at that concept, utilize it the best you can, draw up some other examples, because those examples will need to change too. If you're coaching a lifter and that individual can train 5 days per week or 3 days per week or even twice a week, you'll have to get a bit more inventive with how you're moving things around in the spreadsheet to make sure you're trying to put things first in the order when you can. But if you're having to put them second or third, making sure you can manage your expectations on those movements. For example, if you have to put, if you're doing heavier squats first and then you have volume bench press afterwards, maybe you are dropping a rep or two that you call for on the bench press sets and adding a set. That way somebody's staying a bit shy of failure. You take into account that their strength may be impaired a little bit because they're so fatigued from some other movements. Things like that. Play around with it if you're a coach when you look at those spreadsheets. In part 2 next month, we're going to talk about exercise order again, but we're going to talk about it from a hypertrophy perspective. See what that meta-analysis from Nunez et al. Has to say on the topic, but additionally, get into these practical applications again and say, hey, the findings from the research say this, but is that a black and white statement? Are there situations where we should think about changing around the order for weak points or for something else we may want to prioritize? Or is volume king and we're just good to go with hypertrophy? It's not as big of a deal as it is for strength. So I look forward to that video. With that said, as always, it is an absolute honor and pleasure to do this each and every month, and I will see you next month. Hi everyone, welcome to my video, Volume 7, Issue 10 for October 2023. So this is part 2 of our exercise order series. In part 1, we tackled exercise order for strength. Essentially, did it matter or does it matter when training for maximal strength if you perform multi-joint exercises before single joint exercises? And I would certainly recommend going and watching that video first before you dive into this one. But the answer probably isn't too surprising from a strength perspective, which is yes, in that the exercise that you want to progress strength on should come first or should come earlier in the exercise order. So if you're a powerlifter and you need to increase one arm strength on the squat, bench press, or deadlift, you're going to want to perform those exercises at the beginning of your session, especially if you have, let's say, bench press and then you have, shoulder press and some other assistance movements afterwards. Where it gets a little tricky for strength is if you need to train squat, bench press, and deadlift in the same session. You undoubtedly will at some point if you're a powerlifter because you have to practice like you play to an extent. And on meet day, it doesn't really matter how much you can bench when you're totally fresh. It matters how much you can bench after you squat. Same thing with deadlifting for a one arm after you squat and bench press. So that video tackles all of that. Yes, exercise order matters for strength, but we have to get a little bit nuanced because you can't always do that exercise the very first thing in your session. If for deadlift, for example, you must train it after squat sometimes because that's how it will be done on meet day. So I'd watch that video. I think there's some really good practical takeaways there. But we needed to split this into 2 parts because hypertrophy isn't necessarily the same answer as strength when it comes to exercise order. So part 2, what comes first, multi or single joint movements for skeletal muscle hypertrophy? Is muscle growth going to be the same no matter what exercise you're doing first? Because, hey, it's really all about volume, and volume is the champ here. And as long as we're performing sufficient volume, are we good to go? Or is there some sort of magic in performing the multi-joint exercises first? Or is there potentially some sort of benefit to pre-fatiguing or using pre-exhaustion methods, which would be to do single joint movements first? That's kind of been an old adage in bodybuilding. So we're going to talk about all those things here. So today's objectives, the common thoughts on exercise order. It's a little bit of a recap kind of toward the beginning of what we did in part 1. And what are the common thoughts, kind of how did we get here? How did this thought of exercise order become important over the years? Then we'll take a look at the data on multi-joint versus single joint exercises being done first in the batting order for hypertrophy in a training session. And I want to look at this from a few ways. As I just said on the title slide, I want to talk about it from the multi-joint exercises being performed first, as would be a bit more traditional. And then in objective 3 on the screen, talk about it from the single joint exercise perspective of pre-fatiguing or using pre-exhaustion methods. And we'll define exactly what that is when we get there for those that aren't as familiar. And then I do want to mention combining objectives 4 and 5 here, and I talk about this in mass quite a bit, even when the data seem to say that this thing doesn't matter or this thing matters, especially when the data reveal that this doesn't matter, let's say exercise order isn't important, that sometimes there are very specific situations where we theorize it might, or there are practical considerations that we have to take into account. So we have to look at the studies that are conducted, and we say they were conducted under these conditions. So yes, under these conditions, this thing probably isn't that big of a deal. But if we're training a bit differently, perhaps it does matter. So there are a few situations where I want to point out today that I think exercise order for hypertrophy may look a little bit different in those situations than what the data are saying. That being said, let's get into it all, starting with the common thoughts on considering exercise order. So the common considerations, and I mentioned these first two last time, so we're really going to focus on the last two bullet points, but the old adage is multi-joint should be first. American College of Sports Medicine position stance suggests that the multi-joint exercises should become first. I think that's what people tend to do, which makes a lot of sense if you just think of, hey, a squat is, much more fatiguing than a leg extension. I'd rather get the squats out of the way. And that is one of the practical considerations I'll get to at the end, which is that even if exercise order doesn't matter, from a practical perspective, mentally, maybe you just want to get those big lifts done. For hypertrophy, going down to bullet points 3 and 4, volume and load lifted on multi-joint movements could be compromised when they are performed later in a session. So if we just think of a volume perspective, if somebody does perform those leg extensions before squats, and then by the time somebody gets to squatting, they might be a bit fatigued and they won't be able to perform as much volume as they otherwise could, or at least as many reps per set with a given load. And someone might say, all right, I'd rather perform the multi-joint exercises first. So a few things on that we'll talk about today, which is if you perform single joint exercises before multi-joint, is the volume on the multi-joint impaired? And 2, does that matter? And what could you do to potentially counteract that? So it's not enough just to say that volume could be compromised. It's, does it matter? On the other hand, some might argue that exercise order matters, but they might want to pre-fatigue, which, as I said, we'd get to the definition, is performing typically a single set of a single joint exercises like leg extensions to failure with a light load, and then performing your squats. And that's kind of an old bodybuilding adage. So we'll tackle both of those kind of takes on exercise order. Does it matter for muscle growth? So again, part 1 of this video was seen in just the previous issue to the one that you're watching this in, which was volume 7, issue 9, focuses on strength. And there are a few other articles that are written here in Mass that I would recommend checking out. I referenced some of them in this video. I referenced them in the last video. And I would give a look at those to get some background on this and what we've thought previously, and to kind of get a whole picture of all the references surrounding this issue. But if you want to check out the Mass catalog before diving back into the rest of this video, here are some good resources we've covered before. So thinking of the variables that drive hypertrophy, and red there is the one that we've already talked about, which is volume. And that's really the way to think about this, I would say, which is anytime you're talking about something from a muscle growth perspective, there are, of course, other nuances in that you want to make sure you're targeting all regions of a muscle. You might need to vary exercises to do that. But whenever we're just talking about something like an order, well, how does that affect volume? And then after that, what are the practical considerations, the specific goals? Are there weaknesses to address? So as I said, we'll talk about this question when looking at some of the data. And then depending on the answer to that, we'll go into, all right, this answer is whatever it is, but what are the practical considerations? So the data, to get into it now on exercise order for hypertrophy, there's 3 specific papers that I want to discuss. The first is a meta-analysis from Nunes et al. In 2021, which is one of the articles I've previously covered in Mass. And then there's 2 other original research studies that I think reflect the data from the meta-analysis quite well. And then one of them Avalar et al. Is going to reveal a little bit to us which we're going to circle back to at the end of this presentation, which may help us discuss, maybe there is a benefit to exercise order. We'll get there. But for the moment, these three papers, the main take home from them is that exercise order doesn't matter for hypertrophy, as you can see in red toward the bottom of the screen. And then, as they say underneath that, we'll discuss that exercise order may matter. So let's go 1, 2, 3 through Nunez, Simo, and Avalar et al., looking at these three papers. So the meta-analysis from Nunez 2021, you can see a forest plot here. This is a figure from our previous Mass article. There's just not a whole lot going on. You see one study from Pena a little bit to the right here favoring multi-joint exercises first. One study from Simo, but we're going to look at that. We're going to see there's not much going on there, maybe a little to the left, but both of these effect sizes are small. Everything's pretty much right on this zero difference line. It didn't matter if the measures of muscle growth here or hypertrophy were site-specific or if they were more indirect, body composition, let's say fat-free mass being extrapolated into muscle growth. And the overall effect size here is essentially zero, very, very trivially favoring multi-joint exercises first. So there's just not much going on here. So if you look at this forest plot, this is a really good kind of culmination of the literature, which is to say that, hey, exercise order, the bottom line, if somebody were to ask for a quick answer, a one-word answer, does exercise order matter for hypertrophy? My answer would be no. I'm forced to give that binary yes or no answer. Of course, there's a little bit more nuance than that, but generally, that is a pretty good take-home here, which is as long as you put the work in, you're going to grow, you're going to get bigger, and even if it were to matter a little bit, it's not that big of a deal. It's not like strength, whereas if you do want to improve your one-arm bench press and that's your main goal, and you're always performing shoulder presses first, your bench press is going to be impaired because you're just not going to be able to lift as much load, and load on the barbell is the number one factor driving strength. So I've said this before, but generally training for muscle growth is a bit more forgiving than training for strength. And what I mean by forgiving is that there's a lot more flexibility in what you can do. You can use various exercises. You can train with periodization or not with periodization in those traditional terms. That doesn't really matter too much, if at all. You can perform exercises in different orders if you want. You can use a variety of rep ranges, a variety of loads on the barbell. You can use machine-based movements. You can use free weight-based movements. So hypertrophy is pretty forgiving in that sense, and that you have a lot of flexibility. And exercise order is just no exception to that. Whereas for strength, if you're interested in that maximal strength on a specific movement, you need to prioritize that movement, and you need to train it with high loads at times, and thus lower reps, and get your volume kind of correct on it to an extent. So hypertrophy training or training for muscle growth is a bit more forgiving, and exercise order, again, is no exception. But let's highlight two of those studies in that meta-analysis. They were both in that forest plot, the Simo et al. Study from 2010, and then the Avalar et al. Study in 2019. So Simo was a longitudinal study, 3 groups here. There was one group which trained in a order of muscle groups of large to small, or really multi-joint to single-joint exercises. There was another group which trained small to large, and we can see these two groups down here. We'll go over them. And a control group which did no training. I won't include that in the results since the individuals didn't train, and we wouldn't expect them to grow in that case. There were 31 men that hadn't trained for at least 6 months, so they could have not trained for only 6 months. They could have not trained for 2 years, but we know they were detrained to some extent here. Training was twice a week for 12 weeks. They used linear periodization to train, and the sets and reps were decreasing every 4 weeks, and the load were increasing. So essentially, typical linear periodization volume was going down, and the load on the barbell, or the load on whatever exercise, was going up. So on the left, with the red heading here, and the large to small or multi-joint to single joint, but they use the terminology large to small muscles or muscle groups in this study: bench press, machine lat pull down, tricep extension, then bar curls. And then in the small to large, the bar curls, tricep extension, machine lat pull down, and bench press. So just the opposite order. Now, the outcome measures here were muscle growth, or specifically muscle thickness of the triceps and biceps. So we can see essentially what happens when triceps and biceps are trained after these major movements and what happens when they're trained before these major movements. And I think that's a good design in this case, because if we think of those are muscles that are more isolated, and I'll get back to this at the end, they're only really trained directly by performing a biceps curl or a triceps extension. And so what happens if you bring them out front versus putting them later in the order from a growth perspective? So the findings from the SIMO study, and in short, there's no significant difference in the magnitude of increase in muscle growth between groups. So if we look at the table here, we can see the large to small group, or the group that trained the multi-joint exercises first and the single joint second. And then the single joint first and multi-joint second, triceps here, pre and triceps post, biceps pre-study and biceps post. And there's just not a whole lot going on in terms of differences between groups. Sure, if we look at the triceps, we can see in terms of centimeters muscle thickness, 3.88, and there's no change from pre to post in the large to small. And yeah, 3.47 to 3.75, but we're talking about less than 0.3 centimeters difference between these two in the magnitude of change. That's just not a whole lot going on. And if anything, for biceps, there was a slightly larger change in the large to small, but neither of these differences were significant. So it's pretty clear from the SIMO study that there's not a lot going on here, and it did not matter in terms of the growth for those single joint exercises targeting the biceps and triceps. That for those muscle groups, it didn't matter if the exercises were performed first or second. I will get back to that later. We'll talk about some specific circumstances where maybe it could. We'll just theorize a little bit. But for the data that does exist, the exercise order didn't matter in this case. The other individual study to talk about here is the Avalar study on 2019. So multi-joint first or single joint first, two groups. Again, the individuals in this study hadn't trained for 6 months, so a similar population, similar sample. Training was 3 times a week, 3 sets of 8 to 12 RM. When they exceeded that load, they were able to go up in weight, and they trained for 6 weeks. Now, quite a few more exercises in this study. They trained both the upper body and the lower body. And so if we look at the multi-joint first, they went here, bench press all the way down to curls. You can see the exercises seem to be a bit more targeting a specific muscle group. And then they started over and went back to the multi-joint for the lower body. And then they get a bit more narrow targeting a specific muscle group. And then we're just talking about the opposite order, starting with the upper body here, curls up to bench press, and then calf raise, which was last here, up to leg press. So in this case, the findings for the Avalar study also are showing that there's no significant difference in the increase in biceps muscle growth here and mid-thigh muscle growth over here. So multi-joint first for single joint first, increase here, increase pre to post study in both groups, increase here and increase here, but there's no significant difference. So we'd say similar to SIMO, there was no significant difference in the magnitude of change and muscle thickness between these groups. Now, we're going to get back to this a little bit later. There was maybe something going on with mid-thigh that is we should mention, but I don't think it's strong enough to really stake our case on it. So for now, let's say that there is no significant difference here. And this fits really well with the overall findings of the meta-analysis and the forest plot that we saw. So we'll come back to this study, but the meta-analysis, the study from SIMO, the study from Avalar, exercise order just wasn't really mattering here. All right, so I want to do just a quick setup for the rest of the way. So we've gone through our intro. We've looked at the kind of major findings surrounding the Nunez meta-analysis and then going in to those other 2 individual studies. And so there's really 3 things that the rest of the way, as we kind of just take a quick pause, that I want to highlight to interpret this data and then theorize. So to interpret what we've seen so far, we can kind of interpret it with these 3 points. Number 1, which is what we're going to hit on just after this. Exercise order doesn't matter from the perspective of multi-joint exercises being performed first. Exercise order in number 2 doesn't matter from the perspective of single joint exercises being performed first. I know that sounds a little bit redundant when you think of, well, just say exercise order doesn't matter, right? Because that kind of covers both of them. But I think people tend to look at these in different ways, meaning some people will say exercise order matters because they think multi-joint should be performed first. Some will say exercise order doesn't matter because they think single joint should be performed first. So we're going to specifically talk in our interpretation about how neither of those matter. And then the third part is, and remember that portion of the Avalar study I said we'd get back to, we're going to theorize, hey, could exercise order matter under these specific circumstances? So let's start with 1 and 2 and just kind of interpret the results as we see them as of now and saying, hey, the exercise order doesn't matter from both of these perspectives. So when we say exercise order doesn't matter, for both upper and lower body in the top bullet point here, as long as volume is sufficient, then the order in which they performed doesn't seem to matter. In the studies that were examined, the lifters performed sets to a similar proximity to failure in both groups. Typically it was to failure or very close to it. And the set volume was equated between groups. So we shouldn't really expect a difference there, and the data is not showing a difference, or the data are not showing a difference. Now, hypertrophy doesn't seem to matter here in terms of volume load. Although volume load may be impaired, let's say, on a specific exercise, which is sets times reps times weight lifted in the top bullet point there, in the sense that I mentioned this earlier. If somebody's performing a certain magnitude of volume on squats, now they perform leg extensions first, and then they perform squats after, maybe they can't lift as much weight. And since weight lifted is a component of volume load, perhaps now they're performing a little bit less volume. Or if they keep the same weight and they're performing reps to failure or close to it, then they're performing potentially fewer reps because they're fatigued from the leg extension and they get less volume. Is that a concern? I don't think that's a concern, because if you're moving that single joint movement out front, you're probably doing more volume on that single joint movement, that leg extension or leg curl, whatever you're prioritizing. That probably offsets some of the volume that you won't get on squat. Additionally, you could always just decrease the load and maybe add a set or add more reps on the squat if you're really concerned about it. But I don't think it's enough change in volume load to really matter for hypertrophy, and you're probably getting a little bit more volume on the exercise that you do put out front. So that's looking at, does exercise order matter from the perspective of performing multi-joint exercises first. But now let's flip it around and say, hey, exercise order doesn't matter when talking about somebody who wants to perform single joint exercises first. And this is getting into the concept of pre-fatiguing or pre-exhaustion, as you can see in the heading of this slide. So we're going to look at a specific study that's doing this. And to give the definition of that, the pre-fatiguing or pre-exhaustion, and I alluded to this earlier, is typically performing one set of higher reps on a low load to failure or close to it on a single joint exercise, and then performing your main exercise. So this would be saying, all right, I'm going to perform, a bunch of reps, one set of leg extension with a low load and then squat, or one set of shoulder press and then perform bench press, or something like that, or dumbbell flies, something like that, and then perform that major movement. So the study looking at pre-fatiguing here, or pre-exhaustion, as we could see on the top, had two groups. One group training only the leg press, another group training a single set of leg extensions and then the leg press. Training was twice a week for 9 weeks. If we look at the left, we can see in the pre-fatigue group, they did one set of leg extensions to failure at 20% of 1 RM, and this was before every single session twice a week for 9 weeks. And then they proceeded to perform the 3 sets to failure on the leg press. The traditional group just did the leg press. Now, there was an added set here in the pre-fatigue group, and we'll see what that means for volume when we look at these findings. But was there a significant difference in muscle growth over time? And you can see on the bottom of the slide, we're talking about muscle growth of the quads, 3 different muscles there at a couple different regions on each, and then the glutes. Overall, there was no significant difference in the increase in muscle thickness from pre to post between groups. So pre-fatiguing wasn't more beneficial in this case. Some of these bars, which are the green ones for the pre-fatigue group or pre-exhaustion group, and then the red ones here for the traditional group, some of these bars seem to favor the pre-exhaustion group. But if you look closer, one of them for the proximal region of the rectus femoris actually slightly favors the traditional group, and the error bars are very large. So there's a lot of variation, and there's just really not much to write home here about. And the most appropriate conclusion here would be that in this specific study, it just didn't matter if somebody pre-fatigued their muscle for long-term outcomes. Another interesting component of here is what happened with volume, because while there was an additional set performed in the pre-fatigue group, we can see here, this is the volume here on the y-axis, and in the traditional group, they actually performed more volume. Well, why was that the case? Well, the pre-fatigue group was pretty fatigued, and so on the leg press specifically, individuals were able to perform more reps, and thus they were able to achieve a greater volume. Now, that didn't factor into greater muscle growth or increases in muscle thickness here either. So there just wasn't much going on in this study. You could conclude that it just didn't matter, and so forth. But this does kind of indirectly show that for strength, somebody would certainly be able to lift a higher load if they prioritize the leg press. So that helps make the findings that we talked about in part 1 of this video series, validate those a little bit if we look at this study indirectly. But overall, exercise order just didn't matter in the totality of the data we've looked at so far in terms of whether you want to perform multi-joint exercises first, you're kind of a traditionalist and you think that should be the case, or pre-fatigue with single joint exercises first. But as I've been mentioning, we're going to get to, may exercise order actually matter for hypertrophy? And I'm torn on this if I think it really does matter in a few situations, but I think they're worth mentioning, or I think they're worth exploring. And I say I'm torn on this, and I think that's a good statement in this case, because I don't think we can really know about every circumstance that could possibly come up. And as I said earlier, when we have a study, we say, okay, it doesn't matter under these circumstances. But what about other circumstances? So what are the circumstances that have existed so far? In the top bullet point here, the various studies in the meta-analysis, a lot have included untrained or at least detrained individuals. A couple of the studies we talked about today mentioned folks that hadn't trained for at least 6 months. So these people probably would progress no matter what they did, and it wouldn't necessarily matter if they did a little bit more or less volume on a specific exercise or the order they did their exercises in. And the second bullet point, we refer back to the Avalar study, which I've been mentioning we were going to do. And if you go all the way to this right column, for the mid-thigh muscle thickness measurement, I said this when we were on that slide, I circled this here. You can see there was a 7.2% increase in mid-thigh muscle growth when multi-joint exercises were performed first, a 3.9% increase here, right? That's translating to a 3.3 greater percent increase when multi-joint exercises or leg press was performed before leg extensions for hypertrophy of the mid-thigh. Now, that's to say that, hey, this small difference does exist in the literature for this one measure, but I think we should highlight that it's for that one measure in this one study. It's nothing to kind of hold on to and say, hey, this supports my opinion that performing multi-joint exercises first matters. I don't think it does that. It's just worth pointing out, say, hey, maybe possibly with more research conducted, this could be the case, but it is not something that I would stake my claim to. And again, if somebody were to ask me to give a binary answer, I would say no, exercise order doesn't matter for muscle growth. But a few other things I want to mention and where it might actually matter in terms of performing single joint exercises first would be the way to go. So this is like a specific circumstance that you would set up and say, research just isn't really conducted under these conditions. So if you're using volume cycling, and we've talked about this in mass before, whereas, volume cycling may be appropriate to really spike volume at a certain time. We've seen some studies that look at so much volume over a 6, 8, 10-week span, and they see a little bit more growth during that time. I don't think that's evidence to say, hey, let's use 30, 35 sets, 40 sets a week on the biceps all the time. Rather, that's evidence to me that when there's a large spike in volume and somebody's maybe doing really, really high volumes, kind of overreaching for one short training block, a short mesocycle, that can be beneficial. Then they can probably pull back. And in those situations, if you're doing that for 2 or 3 muscle groups, it's not feasible to do that for all muscle groups at a time. So you do that for a few muscle groups, you pull back, do some more normal-ish volume or maintenance volume, and then increase the volume on those other muscle groups. So if somebody's doing something like that, well, if you're prioritizing, let's say, biceps and triceps, that's a weak point, it might make sense to start the workout with those those exercises, curls, triceps, something like that, because you're trying to prioritize those. Those exercises are only trained directly by performing those movements. You can train the triceps through the bench press, but that's an indirect measure. You can train the curls through various back movements and rows, but that's indirect stimulus. So it might make sense to move these out front for those really, really high volumes. So by the time you get to doing all of those sets, you're not as fatigued. You wouldn't have done any of those other exercises first, and perhaps that would make a difference. As you can see in the last bullet point, there's not concrete evidence to say that this is necessary. It's just me saying, hey, I'm theorizing when this may matter because research hasn't been conducted under these conditions, so it could matter. There doesn't seem to be a downside to doing that, not to the high volumes. That could be a downside at time, but to bringing those movements out front if all you care about is muscle growth. But it could matter because research isn't typically conducted under these conditions. So the practical considerations for hypertrophy and some of the summary here. Overall, exercise order doesn't seem to matter, but it does for strength. It doesn't matter for hypertrophy, it does for strength. If someone is only concerned with muscle growth, then order can mostly be determined by preference. But in bullet point 3 here, which I think is maybe the most important one on this slide, if somebody is training primarily for muscle growth, but they do like training the main lifts, you don't have to, but they like training the squat, bench press, and deadlift, some other skill type of movements, it might make sense to perform them earlier in the session just from a cumulative fatigue and technique perspective. If you're fatigued by the time you get to some single joint movements or machine-based movement, there's not a whole lot of technique that goes into it. Yes, you still need to stay tight. You still need to take a breath and be focused, of course, but there's a lot more that goes into a squat or a deadlift or a bench press technique. And if you've already been training for over an hour on a bunch of single joint movements and you're very, very, fatigued and been targeting that muscle group, by the time you get there, your technique may break down a little bit. And it's probably a good idea in that case, I would say, to move those out front, especially if you're lifting some sort of substantial amount of load that day, or you'd like to, or you have a lot of volume on that movement. So does it strictly matter from the direct perspective of, does this matter for muscle growth? No, we can't say that based upon the literature. But I think mentally too, sometimes it's nice to get those bigger movements out of the way. So I would lean toward performing them first, even if you're only training for hypertrophy, in the sense that if you do a lot of volume on them and there are major players in your program. If they're not major players in your program, you do them a bit here and there with lower loads, might not be as big of a deal, but just some practical considerations. And then in the last bullet point, the volume cycling kind of thing we talked about on the previous slide. So applications and takeaway, short answer again, no. Exercise order doesn't seem to matter for hypertrophy, and it applies to both the take of, hey, performing multi-joint exercises first or performing single joint exercises first, or doing so because you think pre-fatiguing or pre-exhaustion is a good idea. And one thing about that is this isn't being derogatory about saying, hey, performing multi-joint first, or being derogatory about saying, pre-exhaustion, not a good idea. There isn't a difference, right? So when there isn't a difference, I think sometimes we think, oh, well, I've always thought this idea is ridiculous. So yeah, that's right. That's dumb. We're not going to do that. It's saying that, sure, it's fine. It doesn't seem to be impairing the outcomes in this case. For strength, it would, but it's saying that you could do either of those depending on your preference and what you enjoy, and you can mix it up. You do it sometimes, not do it sometimes. So again, to use the terminology I said earlier, training for muscle growth is much more forgiving than training for strength, and you have a lot of that flexibility. And then lastly, it's possible under certain circumstances that exercise order could matter, as I theorized, but these are very, very specific, and I wouldn't get too wouldn't consider this too much. Wouldn't be too concerned about this. So I hope that everybody enjoyed this video. I enjoyed making this video series because I thought we were able to get a bit deeper into the data on exercise order, talk about the situations where exercise order generally doesn't matter, and then kind of get some theories on when maybe it could in certain situations. But as always, hopefully this provided you with some tools to implement the findings for both strength and muscle growth into practice. And as always, it is an absolute honor and pleasure to do this each and every month, and I will see you next month.